Hello. We are going to continue our reading of Tabitha's Travels. Today we're doing the reading for week 3 of Advent, Friday. And so if you have Advent candles in your home, light the 2 violet candles and the pink candle. In our last chapter, Tabitha with Zechariah was traveling to the city of Herodium when at a cafe, she has gone missing. Tabitha pulled at the bindings around her wrists, but with her arms tied tightly behind her back, she could not break loose. The cloth tied in her mouth, like the bit on a horse, kept her screams from being heard. But nothing could keep the stench of dead animals from her nose. She had been sitting at the table in the inn, thinking about her father, when a rough and smelly hand covered her face. Arms as thick as a camel's thigh lifted her off her stool and clamped tightly around her waist. Tabitha screamed, of course, but as her abductor slipped through the crowd of traders, travelers, and taxpayers, they all just turned and looked the other way. Before she could say dancing camels, she had been carried to the back room of a butcher shop. Blood covered the walls and floors from the hundreds of animals slaughtered here. It made everything black and sticky, with a horrible smell. Tabitha struggled again, trying to loosen the bindings on her wrists and ankles. I've lost my place. If only I could stretch them a bit, she thought. But the cloth was well broken in, and any stretch it once had was pulled from it long ago. The thought that she should be crying passed through Tabitha's head, but she quickly decided that if she were going to free herself and save her father, she didn't have time for such things. Crying is something Rachel would do, she thought. I must be stronger than that. And yet, no matter how hard she thought or how much she struggled, she could find no way out of the situation. The walls were strong, and she had heard the locking bolt on the other side of the door slide into place when her captor had left her there. The room was empty, at least as far as she could see, except for a heavy, square table in the middle, and half of a deer hanging from the ceiling. But it was dark, with only a few cracks of light coming through the boards of the door. Tabitha began to shiver, fearing what might happen to her, and where she would be taken. Jehovah, help me, she whispered over and over. The bolt slammed open with a crack, and Tabitha jumped. Her heart began to race as the door swung inward. A man stood in the doorway, but he was lit from the back, so she couldn't see his face. He stood a moment, then walked over to Tabitha. Now she could see that it was not the same man who had kidnapped her. This one was smaller and more round. The man leaned down and looked over her closely. Yes, you will do nicely, the man said. He had an accent that Tabitha did not recognize, and he dressed in the strange clothes of some other world. You will fetch a good price, he continued, and then you'll be off to Rome, where you'll have a pleasant life as a slave girl to a master. The man did not speak with a cruel voice. In fact, Tabitha thought he sounded no more concerned than if he were telling her he should go home to feed his dog. This was a business deal, Tabitha realized. I'm a seller. He's a seller, and I'm his wares. This made her furious, and she began kicking at the man. But he only stood and stood back. You should save your strength, he said, looking down on her. The voyage to Rome will not be as pleasant as this room. The thought that any place could be worse than this slaughterhouse made Tabitha gag. She must do everything possible to try to escape. She must save her father. The man turned and headed back to the door. In that instant, Tabitha wormed her way to her feet, ran across the room, and threw herself at the man's back. He spun around, surprised, and she butted him in the stomach with her head like a goat. At that moment the outer door of the butcher shop opened, and Tabitha saw a woman enter. In that split second, the woman saw Tabitha, or so it seemed to the captive girl, but then the man pushed her down with his foot and slammed the door shut. As fast as she could, Tabitha scooted over to the door and found a crack wide enough that she could see through. "I've come for some deer meat," the muffled voice of the woman said. "I heard you have some fresh. I will require the hind quarter." "The shop is closed," a man's voice said gruffly, and Tabitha supposed it must be her original captor. "Come back tomorrow." "I'm not here for myself," the woman said, and it seemed to Tabitha that she must be a very bold woman to talk that way to a man. "I am the new cook for King Herod, and he awaits me in his fortress." Tabitha didn't need to see the man's face to know he had turned pale. Forgive me, good lady. I will personally deliver the meat to the fortress within the hour." "Very well," the woman answered coldly. "If I am pleased, you will have more business from me in the future." Tabitha couldn't believe that a woman could have such power over a man, and couldn't let this opportunity for rescue pass. As the woman was speaking, Tabitha began kicking at the door and screaming through a gag in her mouth. After a few moments, she stopped to hear what effect her cry for help may have had. The butcher was obviously frightened. "Ignore the racket," he told the woman, trying to usher her out the door. "It is just a goat, who does not look forward to being butchered." "Or perhaps a young girl you've kidnapped to sell into slavery," the woman said tartly. Tabitha could see the butcher's face now as well. "Surely this powerful woman will save me," she thought. "Good lady, there is no girl." The woman silenced him with an upheld hand. "There is a girl," she said, "but fear not. Your business is your own. I only came for meat, not intrigue." The butcher relaxed and promised the cook excellent meat at a fair price as he finally got her out the door. Once it had closed behind her, the butcher seemed to collapse into a mound of jelly. "We must move the girl soon," he said. Tabitha realized the other man must still be in the shop. "Yes," the other voice said, "but first you must deliver your goods as promised. She will surely tell the guards what she has seen if you are late." "Agreed," was all the first man said. A moment later, the door to Tabitha's jail cell opened and the butcher walked in. He carried a large cleaver in his hand, which is a huge knife, and stopped to look down on Tabitha. "I should use this on you," he said, "for making all that noise." He began hacking away at the deer carcass as he continued. "But all is well, and you will fetch a good price if you are alive, and none at all if you are dead." A few minutes later, the butcher hefted the hind quarter of deer over his shoulder and left the room. The door slammed shut, and Tabitha heard the bolt slide into place once more. Several minutes passed as Tabitha heard the man working on the meat. After a while, the butcher left to deliver the venison to the palace. It was then that Tabitha realized she had stopped shivering. In fact, she wasn't afraid at all. It was as if Jehovah was sitting right there next to her, his arm around her, promising to care for her. A few minutes later, the butcher returned. "What about the girl?" he asked. There was a pause. Then the other man said, "Go get her." Whew. What a chapter. Once again, Tabitha finds herself in a terrible situation. Once again, she calls on God for help. And once again, she hears him and his answer. Do you have that kind of faith when you are afraid? Being friends with Jesus is not just a mental exercise. It's not just something we do in our heads. He's real. He's alive. And our friendship with him is real and alive. It's not something that we can stick in a drawer until we're in trouble. Like any other friendship, we keep working at it. We talk to Jesus every day. We communicate with him about all kinds of things. We tell him that we love him. We tell him what's coming up in our lives when the tough times come. And he's right there next to us, waiting to help us like any good friend. In the Bible, the book of Psalms, chapter 34, says that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those that are crushed in spirit. So when we find ourselves in our rooms and in our closets, crying in our beds and in our chairs and on the floor, that's when God comes close to us. When we celebrate Christmas, we're celebrating that the God who created the universe has chosen to come down and live among us. Develop that friendship. Get to know Jesus. He's here to help whenever you need it. And you start that friendship by asking and talking in faith, trusting that he is there. I'll see you next time as we learn more about what's going to happen to Tabitha.